Okay, I saw this on Facebook and I thought I'd try to help. Looking to do a toolpath preview using two toolpaths to layer the overlay on top of the background text in two operations. There is a way to do a preview with two toolpaths, but that will not be a practical way to actually machine something like this with only two toolpaths. Depending on what you assume this means, it doesn't say which is overlay text and which is the background text. I assume he wants this text to be raised over this text by pocketing around this text and then V-carving this text in the pocket area. But to do that in two toolpaths and two operations is a stretch of the imagination. So I will go over a few different ways it could be done with two or more toolpaths, should you want to consider actually machining it as opposed to simply previewing it. We can preview this pocketed with one toolpath, but you wouldn't want to machine it that way because you have to use a fairly small bit to contour around this text, and you'd want to use a larger bit for a clearance tool. So that really takes two or more toolpaths just to pocket around this text here. But that's not the only way this could be done and meet the criteria. So first of all, we have to arrange the elements and convert the text to curves. And then this is the material, and this is a pocket. And we could pocket around this raised text if that's what we want to do, and then V-carve this small text in the pocketed area behind that. But then we need some clearance between the recessed text and the raised text, because if you cut the recessed text up against the raised text, it would leave little nicks all around the edge of that raised text. And you would probably want to V-carve the recessed text because you'd have to use a very small, flat, straight end mill to engrave this text without V-carving it. And to V-carve it, you need more clearance for the angle on the V-carve tool next to this raised text. So making this raised and this recessed is the most complicated way to try to do this, because you do have to worry about your tool clearance around that raised area. It would be much easier to pocket this gray area and then V-carve this small text, and then either V-carve or pocket this large text. And that can be done without any clearance between the two, but it would probably be most ideal to pocket the gray area and then V-carve the text with a little bit of clearance between the two, just so that they don't intersect. And the best way to create that clearance is to offset to the outside and then trim, and then clean that up a little bit, and get rid of those fragments and sharp corners. And one of the problems with trying to pocket around this large text is that is a 0.02 inch radius right there. So you would have to use a 0.04 diameter tool to get that detail. Or if you wanted to use a bigger tool, you would have to take that inside radius into account when creating your clearance. So if I wanted to pocket around this large text with a 0.1 inch tool, I would have to round this to a 0.05 inch radius and then create the clearance to trim this text next to it. You must take the actual tool radius into account when creating clearance around something that you're pocketing with a larger tool. Like this is just a 0.1 inch diameter tool. If you were to use a full 1/8 or larger tool, then you'd have to compensate that much more on your clearance on those inside corners. So really, making this raised is the hardest way to go about this, because these different cuts on different levels cannot intersect. And you have to account for the tool size on both those cuts. And if you're trying to do all that in 2 tool paths, then you're going to be having to use a very small bit to do all that pocketing around this raised text. So you wouldn't want to do it in just 2 tool paths. We can preview it that way, but you wouldn't want to cut it that way. So by far the simplest way to do this in 2 tool paths would be to pocket this and then weld this text together and V-carve that. The best way to do it in 2 tool paths would be to pocket this and then V-carve that and that with some clearance around that large text. And the least practical and most complicated way would be to pocket around that and then V-carve that with some clearance around it. The first option would look like this if you V-carved it, or this if you V-carve the small text and pocket the large text, but then that's 3 tool paths. 2 pockets and 1 V-carve. Of course, we could combine the 2 pockets into 1 tool path if we really wanted to preview it as 1 tool path. But you wouldn't want to cut it that way because you'd have to use such a small tool for this pocket. And this way, the small text intersects the big text, so that won't look quite as good as the second way, which is to leave simple clearance around the big text and then V-carve or pocket the big text. V-carving can be done in 2 tool paths, 1 pocket and 1 V-carve. But again, you can't pocket the big text and V-carve the small text without 3 tool paths, without combining the 2 pocket tool paths. And finally, the third way would be to pocket that and leave that big text raised, and then V-carve the small text with some clearance. And that could be done in 2 tool paths if you want to use the same small tool to pocket this area and get those fine details with one tool, which you wouldn't want to do. So it's one thing to preview it in 2 tool paths, but that doesn't mean you can or should machine it in 2 tool paths. It's a lot more complicated to make this raised and this recessed, as opposed to making all of the text recessed. And that way you don't have to have clearance around the big text. But I think it looks better if they don't intersect, so I would put some clearance. And the big difference is if you recess the big text, it doesn't matter how much clearance you have around it, if any. Whereas if you leave the big text raised, then it does matter how much clearance you have. And that depends on the tool depth and diameter. So that's a lot more complicated. But that's all for now. I'll see you next time.